Hello, everyone. I am Emily Galpern on behalf of the Center for Genetics and Society, and we are a few minutes before the hour. We're waiting until about 5 minutes after the hour to get started. At the moment, we have an introductory slide on the screen, which says, "A Conversation on Disability Justice and Human Genetic Engineering," Monday, April 24th, 2017. Live tweet, hashtag CGS Bioethics, CGS BIOETHICS. Below that, there are thumbnail pictures of each of our 4 speakers with their Twitter handles. Mia Mingus, at MIAMINGUS. Tom Shakespeare, at TOMMYSHAKES. Anita Cameron, at ADAPTANITA, and Rosemarie Garland-Thomson at RGARLANDTHOMSON. Below that it reads, if you need help with Adobe Connect, call Kayla Tolentino at 1-510-665-7760 extension 304, or email Leah Lowthorpe, LLOWTHORP at geneticsandSociety.org. Unfortunately, Alice Wong is not going to be able to verbalize. She wrote some really great remarks, and I am not pulling those up fast enough. But this has been a great conversation between a few different organizations. The primary organization has been the Center for Genetics and Society, with special thanks to Emily Galpern, who's just been an amazing organizer, keeping all of us on task, collecting everything, and we're all very grateful for it. My organization is the Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability. I'm the associate director there, and we were interested in participating. You know, science work like this is certainly a little out of our core area. We do more cultural change work around disability, promoting new assumptions and new ways of seeing disability through our film festival, through disability history. But one of the things that we do is blogging, and I wrote a piece with the Center for Genetics and Society around this because we were very interested with the lack of main conversation happening around this issue that seems so important, and also some of the ways that the issue is talked about certainly ties into the work we do in terms of you know, how is the technology being presented, and how does it often rely on sort of ableist language to sell and get people excited about it. Next organization, and I'll turn it over to Ingrid, who can say a few words, is the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund. Ingrid, do you want to unmute and say a little bit about why your organization is involved in this presentation?
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? Fantastic.
You are.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm with DREDF. I am the development director, and I'm also on this webinar with our senior staff attorney, Sylvia Yee. And I just wanted to say that for me, I was initially interested in this webinar because it hits pretty close to home for me. And DREDF, you know, works from, of course, the core principle of nothing about us without us in terms of human health access, and in this case, bioethics. As a legal advocacy organization, Sylvia and the rest of our staff make sure that we have pretty diverse cross-disability input in these conversations. And I'm really pleased that we're co-sponsoring this, because I've often observed, as a woman with a congenital condition, that it's not that people don't want to hear from people like me, but the conversations do often end up being fairly siloed in academic or research institutions. I'm really happy that we're taking this out for a walk today. And we're going to hear from very different voices who have a lot to offer.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. And now you can unmute, or mute your microphone. So I'm seeing from the chat box that people are very disappointed they're not going to get to hear Alice Long talk. I think you brought in some fans for us, Alice, and then you're letting them down. So the final organization is Alice's, the Disability Visibility Project, which does really important work, if you aren't familiar with Alice, although you most likely are, capturing disabled people's stories and oral histories. She's done some amazing work with StoryCorps. And so I really recommend you get in touch with her, follow her on Twitter, or check out the Disability Visibility Project's blog if you haven't seen it already. Let's see. Okay, so at this time I will pass it over to Marcy Darnofsky, who will say a few words about the Center for Genetic Society and your involvement, and then we'll also go ahead and take us straight into a background on the current controversy about human genetic engineering for reproduction before we hear from our other panelists. Thank you, Marcy. And if all the other co-presenters can make sure that you are now muted.
Okay. Emily, thank you so much for pitch hitting like that and stepping in. And Alice, I hope we get you the technology resolved so we can hear from you later. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm with the Center for Genetics and Society. We're a public interest nonprofit organization that works to bring a social justice perspective and a human rights perspective to the social challenges that are raised by human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies. And we're just delighted to be working with these amazing organizations and speakers, some of them old friends and colleagues, some of them new, I hope. And we're so happy to welcome so many people to this webinar. So I've been asked to just give a few minutes of background information about the technologies that are the basis of what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to start with this title slide. And I'll be audio describing the slides, that is reading the titles and all the words on each side and describing the image. So this is a title slide that says Disability Justice and Human Genetic Engineering, Background on Gene Editing, April 24th, 2017. And my name, Marcy Darnofsky, Center for Genetics and Society. This second slide is titled Gene Editing and CRISPR-Cas9. So the past few years have seen the development and the very rapid spread of a new set of genetic engineering tools that are called gene editing collectively. Gene editing tools can be used to add or to delete or to change genetic sequences. And these new generation of genetic engineering tools are more accurate and more controllable than previous ones, although they're not really quite as accurate or controllable as the metaphor of editing might suggest. CRISPR-Cas9 is the best known of these new gene editing tools. You may have heard about it in news headlines. It's received a lot of attention, and that's because in addition to the greater accuracy that it offers over previous generations of techniques, it is also inexpensive and it's easy to use and customizable, so it's spreading very, very rapidly. So the slide then goes on to list 3 steps in the way that the CRISPR-Cas9 molecular construct actually works. Step 1 reads, guide RNA finds target DNA in cell, which means that a customized molecule of RNA, which is one of the components of CRISPR-Cas9, is able to go through the entire genetic sequence and find a specified sequence of DNA within a living cell. Step 2 reads, Cas9 protein cuts DNA strands. So Cas9 is the second component of this CRISPR-Cas9 construct, and what it does is to cut the double helix, the 2 DNA strands, at the specific point that the guide RNA found. Step 3 reads, replacement DNA inserted. And in this last step, what happens is that the cell's own DNA repair mechanisms are able to rejoin the strand where it was snipped. And it can do that either in a way that deletes what was originally there, or in a way that adds new sequences of DNA that have also been brought into the cell. Okay, the third slide is titled Somatic versus Germline Gene Editing. And this refers to two clearly distinct applications of gene editing. So under the heading Somatic Gene Editing on the slide, there are 3 bullet points. The first reads, if it works, it's gene therapy. The second bullet point is, it affects tissues and cells in existing people. And the last point under somatic gene editing is, it's not passed down to descendants. So somatic gene editing aims to treat existing people who have certain conditions. And it gets that name because somatic means body. And so somatic gene editing affects the targeted tissues and cells of the person who is being treated. So these changes stay with the individual. They're not passed down to future generations. And we said that if it works as gene therapy, because that is one of the promises of the new gene editing tools. In the United States, clinical trials of gene therapy using the older genetic engineering method have been going on since about 1990. But until recently, there has been little success and, in fact, some tragic outcomes, including death, from efforts at gene therapy. But now more promising results are starting to emerge. So then on the slide, we're going to go on to the heading that says germline gene editing. And under that heading, you see 2 bullet points, the first of which says changes genes in eggs, sperms, and early embryos, and the second says inherited by descendants. Now, the term germline is used because eggs and sperm are known as germ cells, and this would, in fact, be passed down to future generations. It would mean changing genes in those early stages, and if they were used to initiate a pregnancy, in other words, germline gene editing for reproduction, that would be the topic of concern. Now, germline gene editing for human reproduction has not been attempted, and in many countries around the world, it's considered off limits, and by many people, it's considered off limits. If it were used for reproductive purposes, the genetic changes that were made would be reflected in every cell of the resulting child, and also in every cell of that child's, any of that child's descendants. And this is really the main focus of our webinar today. The 4th slide is titled Gene Editing in the News, and it pictures the cover of The Economist magazine from August 22nd, 2015. And the magazine cover is titled Editing Humanity, the Prospect of Genetic Enhancement. And the picture on the cover of the magazine is of a white baby crawling and playing with letter blocks A, T, G, and C. And on the magazine cover, there are multiple arrows pointing to various parts of the baby's body. So there's an arrow pointing to the leg that reads sprinter, one pointing to the hair that says no baldness, one to the head reads high IQ, and to the forehead reads low risk of Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and stroke. To the left eye, 20/20 vision, and finally the right ear reads perfect pitch. This magazine covers one of a number that we could have shown that are very similar to this. And so the widespread media coverage of CRISPR has really particularly focused on the prospect of using this new gene editing tool for human reproduction. In other words, to determine the genes and thus the traits of future children and future generations. The next slide is a very brief summary of concerns about human gene editing for reproduction, which is the title of the slide. And there are 4 main bullet points on the slide that summarize those concerns. The first bullet point simply reads safety. This concern is widely acknowledged. Some of the problems that are anticipated are off-target edits or inaccurate edits, and these could lead to all kinds of negative outcomes if a child was to result. Then genetically modified children who seemed healthy at birth could develop serious problems later, and that's often seen in animal studies. And finally, some harms might become apparent only in subsequent generations. The second bullet on the slide reads therapeutic versus enhancement. And this refers to questions that we may want to address later in this webinar, and there are questions like this. What counts as therapy? What counts as enhancement? Or what counts as disease, as disability, as normal human variation? And who would answer these questions? Are these the kind of lines that can be drawn? And if they can be drawn, do we want to draw them? The third bullet reads, reinforcement of the view that disability should always be prevented. Now, many people on this call have thought a lot about these questions, and existing prenatal testing and screening technologies that identify fetuses or embryos with certain conditions. These kinds of tests or screens are presented to expecting parents to use the information so that they can decide whether to continue a pregnancy, or in the case of embryo screening with in vitro fertilization, to decide which embryos to implant. Historically and currently, many assert that using these technologies to select against disabilities reinforces negative and discriminatory attitudes toward people who are living with these disabilities, and it's likely that human gene editing for human reproduction would have raise the same concerns and have those same effects. The fourth bullet on this slide, the last one, is new forms of inequality. Human gene editing for reproduction seems inherently to assume that there are some genes that are good genes and some genes that are bad genes. And one piece of this concern is that those assumptions would inevitably reflect existing prejudices in society, and that this could lead to a future of a society divided into genetic haves and genetic have-nots, and that this could intensify social inequalities and discrimination. The last slide is titled Policy on Human Gene Editing for Reproduction. And it's divided into international policy and U.S. policy. Under the international heading on the slide, the first bullet reads, prohibited by law in more than 40 countries, and the second bullet reads, prohibited by a binding Council of Europe treaty. And that treaty is called the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine. Under the United States heading on the slide, there are three bullet points here. The first reads, discouraged by the National Institute of Health and the Food and Drug Administration, but no formal law in the United States. So those federal agencies, NIH and FDA, recently reaffirmed, in the last couple of years since the development of gene editing, they have both reaffirmed that they won't fund or approve proposals that involve germline modification for human reproduction. But unlike those 40 other countries that I mentioned above, the United States has no legal or formal prohibition against this. The next bullet point reads, public polling shows strong opposition. And this is a consistent finding over a long number of years since they've been polling about this topic. Americans do not want genetic engineering used for human reproduction, and they especially oppose using it for enhancement or to create designer babies, as the media often terms this. And the final bullet reads, National Academy's 2015 Summit and 2017 Report. So this is where a lot of the policy conversation in the United States, at least, has focused in recent years. In December 2015, the National Academies of Sciences and Medicine organized a 500-person meeting in Washington, D.C. Most of the attendees were scientists. There were some historians, philosophers, social scientists who were invited to speak. One public interest organization, that was CGS. And one of the presenters did focus on disability rights, but very few public policy advocates or justice-oriented organizations or people with disabilities were either invited as speakers or attended as participants. At that summit, the organizing committee issued a concluding statement that called for what they termed broad societal consensus before any use of human gene editing for reproduction could proceed. But unfortunately, since that call, there really have not been significant supported efforts to engage the public. And when another National Academies Committee issued a report on human on human gene editing in February of 2017, just a little while ago. That report pretty much dispensed with this call for broad societal consensus, and it did recommend that human gene editing for reproduction could proceed, though within certain limits. So that's it for some background that I hope is helpful, and now we'll hear from Emily Bioethics and from our speakers. So can I ask each of you to unmute your mic?
So the first speaker we'll be hearing from is Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. I'm going to read the bios before each person shares their opening remarks, and we've asked them to speak for 3 minutes. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson is professor of English at Emory University, where her fields of study are disability studies, American literature and culture, bioethics, and feminist theory. Her work develops the field of critical disability studies in the health humanities, broadly understood to bring forward disability access, inclusion, and identities to communities inside and outside of the academy. She's the author of Staring, How We Look, and several other books. Her current book project is Habitable Worlds, Toward a Disability Bioethics. Go ahead, Rosemarie, and share your comments. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Marcy, and thank you to the participants for this really engaging opportunity for us to think about some difficult questions regarding disability justice and genetic engineering. And I see this basically as a conflict. It's a conflict in what we might call modern liberal societies, like the United States and most of the countries, for example, that have laws that protect the rights of people with disabilities, whether those are the kinds of laws that we have in the United States or in other countries, or whether these countries are signatories to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And these are many countries in many of the modern liberal societies now face a conflict, and that conflict is between using medical technologies for selecting for and against different traits and different kinds of people in the interest of what I call procreative liberty, and also in the interest of public health. And that initiative, that principle, if you will, is in conflict with the promise in these liberal societies to provide justice, equality, and inclusion for all members of the social order. So the situation that we're in right now is one in which we have a very robust set of laws and protections for the rights of people with disabilities. We have a very robust disability culture in many modern liberal societies. And we also have disability studies in educational contexts and in knowledge-making endeavors, if you will. And all of those, when they're put together, ask us a question. And what they ask us is to reconceptualize what counts as disease and what counts as undervalued human variations. So in these societies, at the same time that we're being asked these questions, we are also striving at the same time to create human beings who are understood as having advantages in the competition for resources that in modern life liberal capitalistic social orders value a great deal. So these human traits that we understand as diseases, as abnormalities, as anomalies, as disadvantages are taken together as disadvantages or as occasions for suffering as we project them onto a future life.
And Rosemarie, you're at the 3-minute mark, so.
Because of this, what we do is we fail to recognize that these variations that we think of as human disabilities are opportunities, often, for forging meaningful and flourishing lives. And that's what I'd like us to consider in the rest of our conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosemarie. Thanks for starting us off. Next, I'll introduce Mia Mingus. Mia is a national disability justice and transformative justice leader, writer, educator, and community organizer. She's a queer, physically disabled Korean woman, transracial, and transnational adoptee from the Caribbean. Her current project is the Living Bridges Project, an anonymous story collecting project documenting collective responses to child sexual abuse, and her writings can be found on her blog, Leaving Evidence, which is fabulous, and I know lots of people will be Googling right now. That reminds me of one brief remark I want to share before passing it over to Mia, which is that a lot of people are live tweeting and using the handle hashtag CGS Bioethics. So please join in the conversation there as well if you are a multitasker like that. Okay, thank you, Mia. Go ahead.
Hi, you all. Thanks for having me. I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to just try to speak fast and clearly. And I'm excited to be in conversation with everyone. So I'll first say that I used to do reproductive justice work, and I feel like I've been in these conversations now for over the past decade, and they just seem to be getting worse and worse, not to be a Debbie Downer. So I want us to kind of zoom out a little bit because I feel like a lot of the critiques are pretty apparent around particularly disability and ableism and the inherent targeting of disabled communities. But I want to zoom out a little bit more and look at how a culture of ableism really shapes this, and especially also pulling out into even parenting and why the desire for parenting, the ownership of children in particular is something that I think about constantly, and why it is so important that we have to have our own children, we have to have babies only, and why it is so important for people to cling onto the nuclear family, to romanticize things like motherhood, parenting, the raising of children, and romanticizing the nuclear family. And I want to say, too, that in particular, I think that these conversations, what I like about them is that they're very complicated and we have to hold a lot of contradictions. I think in terms of being myself as a queer disabled person of color, a lot of the queer community uses these technologies and embraces a lot of the reproductive technologies, and as well as disabled people and parents and to-be parents. So I just want to name some of these contradictions. I think that the ownership of children is so deeply tied to the history of ownership of land as well, and we cannot get away from that. We cannot get away from the idea that that not only do you feel like you can have your own child, but then you feel the arrogance to even decide traits and create these designer babies and then have those traits be inherited, and inheritable genetic modification, meaning that those traits are passed down from one generation to the next.
Mia,
Yeah.
Mia, you have 1 minute left, but can you speak a little bit louder? Some people are having a harder time hearing you.
Oh, yes. Sorry about that. I also wanted to say
Thank you.
Thank you. I also wanted to say, especially as an adoptee, one thing I think about that's important for these conversations is to talk about children as commodities, and especially as a transracial and transnational adoptee, and the adoption industry and how children, especially children of color, are bought and sold across the globe. And again, reinforcing notions of parenting, and let's not forget the ableism inherent in the ability to parent, and that oftentimes people not being able to parent or not being able to reproduce gets framed as a literal disability as well. And so I don't want us to forget about how we are thinking about these actual children. I know we get lost in the gene conversation and the disability, but let's not forget that these are children who are human beings who will be born. And what happens when those plans don't work out, when you modify your baby or child and they don't live up to those standards? And of course, not forgetting the deep contradiction that most people with disabilities acquire their disabilities later on in life, that there's actually a very small percentage of folks who have disabilities who are born with their disabilities. And so the framing of, being able to make disabled people extinct, and we're going to hunt out these disabling genes, I think it's also misleading as well, as even at the same time as it's harmful.
Great. Thank you, Mia. Next, we'll go to Tom Shakespeare. Tom is a professor of disability research at the University of East Anglia. I hope I didn't butcher that, Tom, in the UK. He's a qualitative sociologist with an interest in bioethics. His books include Disability Rights and Wrongs, Genetic Politics from Eugenics to Genome, and The Sexual Politics of Disability. His current research projects are in the field of rehabilitation, independent living, mental health recovery, and disability and development. He's a member of the Newfield Council on Bioethics and is currently part of a Hastings Center project on the future of prenatal genetic diagnosis. He's been involved with the disability rights movement for 30 years and is currently a trustee of Equal Lives, his local DPO. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you for having me. So the reasons that we should be worried about germline genome editing in humans are safety issues and long-term consequences. However, I don't think this is particularly a disability issue. The disability issue is whether it's okay to take steps to stop future individuals having impairments and illnesses by genetic means. Of course, there are a lot of simpler and easier ways of avoiding illness and impairment, which I would use first, but I don't think that somatic gene editing is wrong in itself. I respect there are differences of opinion on this panel in this audience. People will have different responses, as they do now with prenatal selection. But where gene editing techniques become proven treatments for conditions like cystic fibrosis, or muscular dystrophy, or leukemia, or HIV, I can't see why a parent or somebody directly affected themselves should not opt for them if they want to. I don't think that people with these impairments are inferior or necessarily have bad lives or should not be born. So I don't think we have a moral duty to use these technologies. But I don't see a compelling moral reason not to use these technologies. And I think here we have to think about the whole range of illness and impairment. Some conditions cause suffering and pain. Others cause premature death. Others cause profound cognitive deficits. And others cause trivial differences which have no impact on life and are part of our rich diversity. And partly for this reason about the variability of impairment and illness, people with disabilities have a range of views about gene editing. Some people, particularly those with degenerative conditions which will end up shortening their lives, are supportive of gene editing. Others are opposed. So we have different views like the general public. So to conclude, I would say a firm no to germline gene editing because of the safety fears that Marcy expressed. A cautious yes to somatic gene editing, but only on the basis of informed consent. Somatic gene editing has lots of potential, and that means we don't need to investigate germline gene editing at this moment. And finally, a plea to the disability world, to everybody listening and participating, please think deeply about these questions, challenge your assumptions. We don't speak with one voice, but our many voices should be heard. And thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. And next we will have Anita. Disability rights activist Anita Cameron has been involved in social change activism and community organizing for 36 years. As a teenager, the 51-year-old Chicago native joined peace and justice organizations and participated in nonviolent civil disobedience. In 1986, Anita joined ADAPT, a national grassroots disability rights organization, and has been a member for 31 years, serving as a national organizer, strategist, and police negotiator, and is very proud of the fact that she's been arrested 126 times with ADAPT doing nonviolent civil disobedience after the style of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you for joining us today, Anita. So the call-in people can hear her, but we can't. We're going to read Anita's comments. And then in the meanwhile, we'll try to figure out how to make sure Anita can join for the Q&A. Here's Anita's comments that she shared before the webinar with us. She said, gene editing, whether used for disease eradication or human trait enhancement, spells bad news for the disability community and racial minorities, particularly blacks. Though gene editing is stated to be used to prevent, quote, serious, unquote, diseases, despite, quote, safeguards, unquote, it could be used to prevent all disabilities, in effect a form of genocide on our community. Blacks and people with or perceived disabilities have had unwanted procedures such as sterilization, as well as, quote, studies, unquote, and experimentation done in our communities with our consent or knowledge. This technology would be expensive, so even if wanted, it wouldn't be available to most disabled or blacks due to poverty and racism. Thank you, Anita. Okay, sorry everyone for these technological problems. No matter how many run-throughs you do, it just tends to want to fail the day of. Okay, so if all the presenters can unmute, we'll begin the Q&A and we'll continue to work on the back end to get Anita to be part of the conversation. So my first question, and I'll direct these at certain people so that we can try to hear from everyone. My first question came from, working with CGS. They reached out to me and wanted to have a conversation around, how do we have more people involved in this conversation, and who's talking about it, specifically following the summit that Marcy mentioned, where there was no one with a physical or visible or invisible disability presenting on disability at the conference. Where disability was what everybody was talking about, but there wasn't a presence of disabled people in the room. Do you think it's fair to say that there haven't been a lot of people involved in this, and this is a new topic to people? What do we make of that, if that's the case, and how do we get more conversation happening? Whether or not, depending on, or it doesn't matter what side, we want more voices here, and how do we make that happen? Tom, would you begin as somebody who's been working closely on this?
I think there are examples of where disabled people have been involved. There was a conference at the Royal Society of Medicine in London a few months ago, and Mick Scarlett and another disabled colleague participated very strongly and in fact dominated the debate. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics here in the UK is having a working party about gene editing, and Jackie Leach-Scully, who's a deaf bioethicist, she's participating. So there are examples. I think that we need to argue that more voices should be heard, but also we need to get up to speed. We need to keep in touch. There are lots of, in the popular science media, there's lots of descriptions of this technology. So I hope that people, for example, people on this webinar will educate themselves and will speak increasingly and with confidence about these questions, whatever they think about them.
Great. What is your feeling in the communities you're a part of, Mia? What has your experience been?
I think what's hard is that, can you all hear me? I turned up my microphone. I think what's hard is that it doesn't surprise me that there's no disabled people present at these conversations, even though they're implicitly, inherently about disabled people. One, the people have conversations about those most impacted without having them there constantly, and that's true across the board, not just disabled people, especially people of color, queer people. We could go on and on. So that doesn't surprise me, but I think that one of the reasons why is that disability, unlike maybe some other oppressions, is so ingrained and normalized to be understood as being not just less than, but like evolutionary less than, like on this natural, quote-unquote, natural fundamental level, that I feel like people do feel that it is okay to exclude disabled people, because the assumption is that we would be on board with these technologies as well, because the assumption is that we don't want to be that disabled people do not want to be disabled. And so I think that that's definitely true. I also think that, yes, we have to hear more voices. And there's also an urgency in my mind to this that is hard to balance. How do we do both, and how do we hold that we want to have more conversations and hold the complexities of individual and collective justice, which are very hard to do, and that we can have both of those at the same time, and hold that with the urgency, because these technologies are continuing to move forward and more people are using them. And if people are continuing to deselect disabling genes out of their babies as they're designing them, how do we catch up with that as we're racing to try to have these conversations?
I think the urgency really leads into the next question I was going to ask. We're having a feedback loop. Mia, can you mute your mic for a second? About the rhetoric here. How are these devices being sold? What language, what images are being used, and how does that impact the effect on people with disabilities' lives right now? Regardless of whether or not the technology does become available, does start affecting people with disabilities, and what other ways can it can the debate alone impact people with disabilities? Rosemarie, can you start that off for us?
I would like to say something about that. I think what we need to do is to continue in every way we can to participate as fully as we can in every aspect of society, using whatever institutional advantage that any of us might have, whether we have blogs, whether we are activists, whether we, in any kind of work that we have, to bring forward what we know, and that is that disability does not necessarily ruin a life. And that to use the term that the Hastings Center uses often, that we can flourish with disabilities, that that disability is not necessarily a disadvantage, because there is an overwhelming belief that disability equates with a ruined life, that disability short circuits, that it closes down futures, when in fact many people with disabilities have very high quality of life. But I think that in the conversation about genetic engineering, we want to be careful to, I think the concept of designer babies is actually a very corrosive one, because I think that people who consider, through what I'm calling procreative liberty or reproductive liberty, who consider using processes of selection to have certain kinds of babies, don't understand themselves as designing babies. Rather, they think of producing babies or children, bringing children into the world that have the best advantages. The utilitarian philosophers say things like, we have a moral obligation to have the best possible children with the best possible lives. It's that belief that gives people who want to use reproductive selective processes, it gives them a way of thinking that is ableist. It's common sense ableism that says, well, why should we have people in the world with disabilities? And that's what we have to work against. We have to work against this concept of what is the best person, the person with the most advantage. And as far as I can see, the only way we can do it is to bring our stories forward, to find stories of people who live with disabilities and live well with disabilities, people who function as so many of us do, as full participating citizens in these orders that have laws, that have an ideology of equality, that allows us not to be discriminated against, that gives us opportunities to access to the places and the opportunities that non-disabled people generally have access to: education, employment, health services, transportation. These are what all of us have worked towards.
Thank you, Rosemarie.
And this is what we want to provide for all people with disabilities.
Thank you. Anita, are you on yet? If so, can you start talking? Okay, we're going to keep moving along, and we're going to make sure to find a way to get Anita's comments and concerns heard to you all afterwards if we're not able to get her in. Well, what you just laid out, Rosemarie, is you know, the very common sort of concern about the way we respond to the idea of, you know, well, we can draw these lines and think about what is suffering and what isn't suffering, because suffering is so tied to the social conditions. You know, if we leave it up to choice, individual choice, Tom, as you advocate, what do we do to push for more informed input? And I think one of the co-sponsors, Sylvia from DREDF, pointed out, especially in the age of Trump, for those of us in the States right now, what does it mean for us to leave it up to choice when we know wider than Trump that people often make choices against their best interests. Tom, can you respond to that?
Because things went strange my end. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. You mentioned, some specific conditions where you wouldn't want to be opposed to them, and it's tied into that sort of idea that there is some real suffering. It's not all just social conditions, social situations that create disability. There are some impairments that are, that people might not want to live with. But a lot of disability advocates have said, yes, that's true, but there's also so many conditions that get clumped in as just physical suffering, and, we know them to be very tied to social conditions, and those lines get very blurry. So if we are going to leave it up to individual choice, how do we provide informed input to help people make choices that are not going to be, against their best interest?
Well, to start with, I think that almost all disability is an interaction of a health condition with an environment. So almost always we can improve the environment, or we could do something about. Often we could do something about the health condition. It's not an either or. Somebody's saying on the chat box, look, I've got muscular dystrophy, what are you going to do about the environment? I'd say, look, let's try and improve the environment. Let's do everything we can to make sure you've got a proper wheelchair, that you live in a proper apartment, that you can get a job. All of that is non-negotiable. We're all agreed on that. But at the same time, where there are people who are losing function and who are unhappy about that, if there was a therapy that could do something, and there may be something coming along, why would we not want to use that? Some of us would, some of us wouldn't. But it's a matter of choice. And if you ask me about how can we make sure people have an informed choice, well, we have to be like we do with any medical treatment. We have to tell them all about the risks. We have to tell them, look, it's not going to be a cure, but it might give you a bit of extra function. These are things you might like. This is why it might be painful or not painful or whatever. It's the usual informed consent thing we do with any area of medicine. It's not a substitute for environmental change, but I don't see why it couldn't be an addition to it. Just thinking about gene therapy, there was recently a success with sickle cell disease. Now, sickle cell, as I understand it, is a painful disease. If you could make it less painful, less attacks, then why not? Things like hemophilia, beta thalassemia, Parkinson's, severe combined immune deficiency. Now, I'm not saying it works for all of these, but it's been attempted, and they have had some success. This is gene therapy. Now, if you could do that with quicker, easier, cheaper, with gene editing, would we really be opposed to that? A lot of these things, they're not the static impairments like spinal cord injury or whatever it is that we have. These are diseases that people suffer and die from. I'm not going to stand in their way or sit in their way if they want to try treatments, as long as those treatments are properly researched and people are given informed consent as to whether they want to participate.
Mia, do you want to respond to that, given the questions that reproductive and racial justice advocates have raised about the limits of choice? And then I'll say that after you, Mia, I'm going to ask Anita to speak. And wonderfully, Jessica Lehman from Senior Action Disability Network has offered, she's listening in on the phone, and she's offered to transcribe what Anita is saying so we can read it aloud and at least hear Anita in one point of this conversation. So I think that's the perfect question to bring her in on too. But Mia, can you go ahead and speak to that? Mia, we need you to unmute your microphone, please.
Thank you for reading my mind, Emily. I had Beyond Choice written and circled on my paper as I was listening. So there's a couple things. One is that I think, the reproductive justice movement and racial justice movements have talked about this in depth, so this is nothing new. But having a critique on individual choice and also realizing that individual choice is a privilege. Like in the world that we live, it shouldn't be, but in the world that we live in, that's where we are right now, and that there's so many people who do not have choices. And so how do we understand all of these questions that are, I love how complex and sticky they all are and messy within the current context that we live in, though, and not that anybody's doing this, but not inside of a vacuum of fantasy, which is what I feel like a lot of other debates end up being had in. And then the other thing that I also want us to caution against is I want to caution against moving towards equality and assimilation, and actually going towards justice and liberation, which I feel like are much harder. That, you know, we can try to be good citizens, we can try to show that we live good lives and productive lives and capitalists, and that we're able to be part of capitalism and, you know, earn capital or whatever. But I don't think that those things are, we can look back in history and look back across movements, not just disability movements, but across different movements, and look at how the move towards equality and assimilation and this kind of inclusion model has not necessarily worked well for us in terms of thriving. While it might help us to survive, but usually it helps those who are already at the top to continue to survive. And it doesn't question why some people are perpetually at the bottom. And I say this all the time, we don't want to simply expand the ranks of the privileged and just add in a couple more people, in this case more disabled people. We want to question that whole system and say, why are some people consistently at the bottom? And I think the comments that Anita has made, and I know what Anita was going to talk about and will talk about, especially I feel like for people of color, especially for women of color who are disabled, especially for queer and trans people of color who are disabled, who are often living at the very, very bottom and subsisting in poverty many times, or who are subsisting close to that. So how do we challenge ourselves to have those broader conversations? And I think that part of those conversations inherently mean that we have to grapple with this, how to balance individual and collective justice together. That what individual justice for one person may come at the expense of collective justice for a whole group of people. We see this in the criminal legal system, we see this using police and prisons, right? How do we extend this kind of thinking and this framework into this conversation around disability and genes? Whereas one family, for example, or one community might be like, oh, using these genetic tools are actually really useful for us, even as they're targeting disabled communities, and as they have been used to target, I mean, the legacy around sex selection, the legacy around white supremacy in terms of what kinds of genes are considered desirable, and the legacy of people choosing blue eyes or blonde hair, light skin. I mean, these are all very, very real, let alone the very real history around eugenics that has been done on people of color across the board, particularly indigenous and black people. So how do we hold all of those complexities as we're having these conversations?
Thank you, Mia. So Anita, if you can go ahead and talk into the phone, somebody will transcribe it so that we can read it aloud for everyone joining us by computer. She's just tweeting out a couple of minutes ago, communities of color, particularly black and poor, have the experiments without knowledge or consent happen to our community quite a bit. Cells were being used to help others without her consent. I look at this from a class perspective. Let's be honest. Technology is going to be quite expensive. Access to that technology will be poor. Okay, she stopped. Sorry for everyone that was listening on the phone and I was interrupting. Just not processing the layers of this. And thank you again to Jessica, our transcriber. I love the interdependence, making it all work as a team model. Okay, a lot of what we're talking about won't be available to people like me who are poor, which is part of why I'm so glad to participate in this. I'm pretty far on the bottom of the socioeconomic stratum. Most often people who have access to this, people who get to make that choice, they have a privilege that the vast amount of us do not have. So how do we bring this to poorer communities, less educated communities, communities of color who wouldn't know about this? Any harm? That's the thing I grapple with. Okay, thank you so much, Anita, and thank you, Jessica, and my apologies there. That was some complicated technology stuff. Okay, so thank you all. So at this point, I'll begin to ask some of the questions that are coming in from audience members, and you're welcome to continue asking them. We've gotten some good ones already. A question for Tom. I have muscular dystrophy, degenerative, etc. My question, how can you separate the reality that I still live in a built world that resists access renovations, even as it normalizes and presents as, quote, progress, me renovating my DNA? Do you want to respond to that, Tom?
I already did. I think we should do both. We should promote environmental change and challenge oppression, but we should also develop medical advances where we can do so safely. Obviously, we need to have a health service that makes those available to people so that they're not disadvantaged through cost. But, you know, in principle, I can't see why we can't do both.
Someone asked, regarding Mia's point about children as commodities, how do you balance the opportunities for same-sex couples having families? Mia, would you like to respond to that?
Yes. I don't think it's a contradiction. I think that queer parenting is amazing, and I have been witness to and seen amazing things. I have many friends who are queer, people of color in particular, who have had children, and so I don't think that they're in contradiction. I think that we, just like everything else, we can have deep, rigorous, and grapple with our analysis of things and our decisions. And we can also make decisions for our lives in the same way that we do with everything else, in the same way that we're able to hold complexities all ways around. I would hope that any human being, queer, disabled, people of color, white, straight, whomever, would think very, very deeply around why am I having children? Why am I having, I know it sounds like such a simple question, but it's very hard to answer that. What are your reasons? Are you having children to fulfill your own desires? Are you having children for your parents? Are you having children to fulfill society's desires of yourself? Are you having children to live vicariously through them? If you are only having children so that you will have a perfect, smart, able-bodied, straight, these are questions that I think all of us need to be collectively involved in, because children should be our collective responsibility. And again, when you think about why you're having children, are you prepared for what if your child is or becomes disabled? What if your child is or becomes queer and or trans? How are you going to support them? Are you okay with that? If you are not okay with these questions, then perhaps you should not have children. And I feel like it's very simple. And I would just hope that whether people are queer or not, they would think about those things. And I actually feel like because within disabled parenting as well as queer parenting, because the process of getting pregnant tends to be usually, not always, but usually more intentional, people are having these kinds of conversations. Not necessarily, like queer people I don't hear talking about disability, but they definitely talk about queerness and transness. And then disabled people definitely talk about disability, but they don't necessarily think of queer and trans. So, I mean, we need to do better on our intersectionality, of course, but that's always. I think that especially for disability, this is a very real question that all parents and parents-to-be should be thinking about. And not just whether your child is born with a disability, but if they fall off the monkey bars, or if they get sick. We are living in violent and polluted conditions. Our world is only getting more violent and more polluted, and these are real questions.
That's excellent. Responses from everyone. I'll also give you more of a chance to respond to each other here. There was a follow-up question tied to the first one to you, Tom. Tom, my point is that our culture is overwhelmingly biased toward the individual overcomer model, and this reinforces that. And I'm saying this as a person with a disability who works to dismantle structural discrimination. How would you work to eliminate that inherent bias?
I want to promote diversity. I want to have positive images of disabled people in the media. I want to celebrate, you know, the fact that Lenin Moreno is elected president of Ecuador. You know, every time we see something positive, we celebrate it, we research it, we put it on the media, we share it, we have role models for our children. We must be more accepting of the diversity of humankind. I agree completely, and there are many ways and many people on this panel and in this audience are trying to do that. But I mean, you know, when we're talking about things like severe combined immune deficiency, when we're talking about things like Duchenne muscular dystrophy or cystic fibrosis or the rest of it, you know, I don't think that the diversity model works. These are things that people suffer from and die from. These are things that people lose function with. Are we really going to stand in their way? Are we really going to say you shouldn't try this, or it's reducing diversity, or it's attacking disability? It's about trying to help people survive. And most of us would take medical care. Most of us get inoculated, vaccinated. If we had cancer, we'd have chemotherapy. You know, why are we so bothered about this? You know, the question is, I completely agree that germline gene editing is a step too far. It's too risky. It's too dangerous. It passes on to other generations. It's problematic. But the basic project of somatic gene editing, or indeed using these technologies to create model animals so that people can do medical research without having to involve patients. You can create a cell line which has the genetic issue that you want to explore and treat. All of these things are made possible by gene editing. So I really hope that people don't go away from this webinar thinking gene editing is bad and gene editing will make us all heterosexual and ableist or whatever. Gene editing is a tool. We need to use it in the right way, not the wrong way. And this debate and more debates like this will help us shape that way.
Someone asked, can we explore some more about Anita's questions around class and bringing these topics service to the poor communities of color? What are some strategies that we can come up with? I'm told that tech support thinks that potentially we've resolved your problem. Anita, can we hear from you? All right, if the people on computer are not hearing, I know the people on the phone are hearing, so I am interrupting you, Anita, in that case, and I greatly apologize. We're going to make sure and ask Anita if she would be so kind as to write up some remarks that we can share on blogs. I know that she also blogs to make sure that the important concerns she's raising are heard. Is somebody else interested in responding to that question around class and how do we bring these to different communities, especially poor communities of color? Maybe this is a good opportunity to bring Marcy Darnofsky in. You're also participating, and questions can be directed at her as well. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And I want to tell everyone that actually CGS already has a blog online written by Anita. And we'll get you that, a way to connect to that. It's going to be on our website, which we're in between websites, so we have to launch the new one before you can see it on our website in the next few days. But I did want to, I was really glad when Mia brought up the term eugenics, because I do think that term belongs in this conversation about using gene editing for future generations. And I think it's a prospect that, in fact, people with disability and disability rights and justice organizations among all civil society sectors, that's actually been better at addressing than most other, even social justice organizations. And I think it's important to think about the extent to which there are deep-seated assumptions and temptations, really, to think about difference as biologically based betterness or worseness. And I think that's a lot of what underlies eugenic thinking and underlies the kind of eugenic thinking that is leading some people today, including some prominent scientists and futurists and others, to advocate that we go full speed forward with gene editing for reproduction, germline gene editing, in order to produce these supposedly superior children for those who can afford access to that technology. And this is really separate from many of the considerations about using gene editing as a medical technology, as a gene therapy. It's really, for some people, an explicit good to engineer the human race so that those who can afford it who already have privilege can give their children another leg up and be thought to be, even if they're not, biologically superior.
May I add to what Marcy's saying? Certainly in the United States, make no mistake that gene editing will be driven by the market, as reproductive technology is already driven by the market. And what that means is that only certain people will have access to it, and the conditions, the ways of being in the world that are going to be selected against will be determined by what the market decides is an advantage or a disadvantage. And that's why it's really important that people with disabilities have as much voice as we possibly can in trying to change the conversation away from this idea that disability is always a disadvantage, that being non-disabled will provide, being non-disabled, being white, being male, whatever the statuses of privilege are, that they will create a good life for people. And I think that's where we have to do the most work. Poor people will never have access to these technologies, but the people that do make these decisions as to how these technologies are developed, what characteristics are selected for and selected against, that's what we have to be really careful about. And try to have some kind of input into the conversation.
Thank you.
Can I also add?
Go ahead, Mia.
I also just want to say, I appreciate Tom's comments, and I feel like there are a lot of complexities here, and we can't forget the context in which this is happening. I was glad that Rosemarie talked about the marketplace, because I feel like that's just one of the pieces of the broader conditions that these technologies are taking place in. It's not the case that they're just being dropped into this vacuum and not being used for other things. I mean, when we look at the history of genetic modification and the rush to find, as we always say, biological roots to social problems, when we think about how this technology has been used to hunt out the gay gene, or to find the poverty gene, or to find the overweight gene, or all of these things, right? The gene for crime. I mean, trying to find biological roots to social problems, it has cost us so much. And we know that that's not true. And I feel like this disability conversation is very similar. Even though there are people who are born with disabilities, and there are genes that are disabling, again, we're being duped and being told that if we hunt out these disabled genes, then we'll stop disability, when we know that that is not true. And if we really want to stop disability, perhaps we should think about stopping war, domestic violence, state violence, intimate violence. Perhaps we should think about saving the planet and not polluting the air as much as we do. Perhaps we should think about these types, paying attention and giving our attention to social problems that are happening. Perhaps we should think about ending poverty, and perhaps we should think about addressing addiction better. I mean, these are all questions that I feel like, yes, we want some of these technologies may be useful for some things. Chronic pain is real. We can't get away from bodies. We can't get away from things like that. Those are real things that I feel like the disability community in particular is uniquely positioned to address, these kind of complexities. But we can't do that without also bringing in the social context that we live in. And then I also just wanted to say as well that, I think when we talk about these technologies, we can't forget that it comes out of a legacy that's very gendered ableism of wanting to control birth across the board, and in particular control bodies who can birth. That this is what this has come, the legacy that we come out of in these conversations. And so we can't forget about misogyny. We can't forget about the ways that patriarchy and male supremacy has played into this.
Thank you. I'm seeing so many great comments in the chat and so many questions that could keep this conversation going for some time. So it's hard to cut it off, except that, that was really the goal of all of these organizations working together and all of the panelists, is to start a conversation and to continue it. And so we're going to provide all sorts of ways for more involvement. CGS has shared Anita's blog. Reagan Brashear is making a film about this right now. There's a lot of people who are interested in hearing your thoughts and learning more. So let's find ways to stay involved. I'll pass. Marcy, do you have any final words on CGS's end of things?
Well, I just want to say that I think this is an amazing conversation, and the beginning should be the beginning that we can continue. And we'll see as much as we can what we can provide to everyone by email about this is a very rich chat box here with back and forth all through the webinar, and a very rich Twitter feed that I was looking at occasionally. So we'll try to share as much of that as we can, as soon as we can, and would really love your feedback on next steps that you'd like to see.
And then can I ask each of the panelists to just say, one or two sentences of what you want people to think about as they walk away from this. Let's start with Rosemarie.
I think I would want to make a call for solidarity amongst us all, and for more opportunities for us to collectively build disability culture in its very broadest sense. The kind of work that Mia does, all of us do. Alice Wong's Disability Visibility Project, all of these things contribute to bringing forward disability justice from people with disabilities across the entire social order. And thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Emily, for giving us this opportunity to talk together. We have been hidden away much too long.
Mia.
I also want to extend gratitude. Thank you so much for organizing this. And I think the last thing I would say is that if you continue to be part of these conversations, just how important it is to include disabled people. I want to plug especially disabled people of color, especially disabled queer people of color in these conversations so that we can be part of it, because it impacts us. And the fact that there are so many conversations like this going on without us in it is just shameful, I think.
Tom.
Okay, thanks for having me. I also think we should promote the diverse voices. I think we should particularly hear the voices of people with degenerative conditions, genetic conditions, who are the people who these treatments might help. I think we should hear them, and I think we should not stigmatize them. I think none of us want to lose function. None of us, we are happy as disabled people the way we are, but equally, if I said to any of us, right, I'm going to take away some of your functioning, some of your senses, some of your physique, you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want to lose more function than you already have. So if you have that instinct, if you have that feeling, then consider that it's not wrong to try and do our best to improve the functioning of people as well as remove barriers in society. We can and should do both. Thank you.
Thank you. And Anita, I'm going to try one last time, and I think the people on the phone can hear you. So here's what I'm going to suggest. We have 30 seconds of silence. People on the computers will not hear you. We're getting them typed in. Wonderful. I'll be quiet. Okay. I would say that this conversation, it needs to get to the people who have very little privilege or no privilege. This is inherently speaks to a lot of privilege in class. There are whole parts of humanity who don't even know about these conversations or this technology. Whether it will benefit them or harm them, they don't know. So we need to take it out of the stratosphere and bring it down to earth. We need to talk about how we can get this out, reach out to poor people with disabilities, poor people of color, poor LGBT folks, all of the people who would never ever even hear about this. We need to get this out to the community at large, out to the province of geneticists or bioethicists or whatnot. This has to get down, for lack of a more appropriate term, regular working class poor folk. It's very important that our voices get heard as well. Thank you everyone who joined us and stuck with us through some tech stuff. We'll send, as we said, many opportunities for continuing the conversation, and thank you again to our organizing groups and presenters, the Longmore Institute on Disability, Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, Disability Visibility Project, and above all to the Center for Genetics and Society. Thank you everyone.